Sometimes the heart sees what younger eyes cannot. Sometimes love finds us when the world believes we're too old for second chances. In a dusty frontier town, a mountain man named Tobias shocks everyone at the bride auction by choosing Opal, a 70-year-old widow with silver hair and gentle eyes. The crowd laughs at him. Why would any man want an old woman when younger ones stand waiting? But Tobias knows something they don't. This woman once saved an entire mining camp during the worst winter anyone could remember. She raised 5 children, alone after losing her husband. Her weathered hands tell stories of strength most people never find. What makes a strong man choose the woman everyone else overlooks? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clearwater's main street, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories above the weathered boardwalk. This frontier town, nestled between rolling hills and the promise of mountains beyond, had seen its share of desperate men and brave women, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold at Patterson's general store. Opal Fairweather stood at her kitchen window, watching the early bustle of townspeople preparing for the monthly gathering. At 70, her movements were deliberate but sure, hands that had delivered babies, and closed eyes in final rest, now smoothing down her best grey dress. She'd removed her wedding ring that morning, the simple gold band worn thin by 37 years of marriage and 23 years of widowhood. It rested now in her pocket, a small weight against her hip, a reminder of the life she'd built from nothing and the love she'd lost too soon. Her reflection in the window showed silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, lines etched by prairie winds and sorrows, but eyes that still held the spark that had once convinced an entire mining camp to trust a young woman's wisdom during the brutal winter of 1851. Those same eyes had watched her husband disappear into the earth when the Copper Ridge mine collapsed, leaving her with 5 children and a determination that poverty would not claim what death had tried to take. The children were grown now, scattered across territories and states, living lives she'd made possible through years of taking in washing, tending the sick, and growing vegetables in soil that barely wanted to cooperate. She'd learned to set bones, deliver babies, and nurse men back from the edge of death because Clearwater had no doctor, and someone had to know these things. Her hands remembered every fevered brow, every grateful squeeze, every final breath she'd helped ease into peace. But today felt different. Today, the town's well-meaning but misguided charity had finally worn her patience thin. The ladies' auxiliary had decided that Opal needed companionship and had somehow convinced her to participate in what they delicately called a social, a gathering. But what everyone knew was a bride auction, a frontier tradition that treated women like livestock and men like buyers at market. 3 miles outside town, Tobias McKenna was saddling his horse with the same methodical care he brought to everything in his solitary life. At 58, his weathered face told stories of decades spent in places where civilization was just a rumor, and survival depended on reading the language of weather, animals, and the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. His cabin sat in a natural clearing where a creek meandered through pine and aspen, a structure he'd built with his own hands, from trees he'd felled and stone he'd quarried. Every board, every chink between logs, every carefully crafted detail spoke of a man who'd learned that if you wanted something done right, you did it yourself. The carved mantelpiece above his stone fireplace showed scenes of mountain wildlife. Elk in meadows, bears fishing streams, eagles riding thermals, images he'd worked on during long winter evenings when the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, but the silence had grown heavy over the years. What had once been peaceful solitude had gradually become something else, an isolation that felt less chosen and more like a sentence he'd imposed on himself, after learning that people could disappoint you in ways that cut deeper than mountain. Cold, He'd come to Clearwater twice a year for supplies, speaking only what was necessary, conducting his business with the efficiency of a man who valued his solitude above social pleasantries. But lately, something had been shifting inside him, a recognition that the life he'd built in reaction to old hurts might be costing him more than he'd realized. The decision to attend today's gathering hadn't come easily. For weeks, he'd wrestled with impulses he'd thought buried, dreams that visited him in the quiet hours before dawn, dreams of shared meals, quiet conversations, the simple comfort of another human presence that didn't demand performance or pretense. He'd tried to dismiss these feelings as the foolishness of a man getting older, but they persisted with the same quiet insistence as water finding its way through stone. In town, the gathering was taking shape with the organized chaos that marked all community events. The auction block, a weathered wooden platform that had seen everything from livestock sales to political speeches, stood ready in the town square. Women of various ages, mostly widows and spinsters, arranged themselves with varying degrees of dignity and desperation. Some were young, fresh-faced and nervous. Others carried the practical bearing of women who understood this was business, not romance. Mayor Harrison Caldwell climbed onto the platform, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, our frontier life can be harsh and lonely. Today's gathering serves the noble purpose of bringing together souls who might find companionship and mutual support. The crowd murmured approval, though Opal caught the undercurrent of excitement that had more to do with entertainment than noble purposes. She'd seen enough of human nature to know that people enjoyed spectacle, especially when it didn't touch their own lives. Young men clustered near the platform, evaluating their options with the calculating eyes of buyers at horse auctions. Middle-aged widowers stood with their children, seeking practical arrangements that would provide care for their households. A few older men lingered at the edges, understanding that their choices would be limited to women their own age or older, women deemed less desirable by younger suitors. "We'll begin with our younger ladies," Mayor Caldwell announced, and Opal watched as girls barely out of childhood were presented like prize flowers, their youth and presumed childbearing capacity driving spirited bidding. The transactions were concluded with handshakes and nervous laughter. New partnerships formed with the efficiency of business deals. As the afternoon progressed, the crowd began to thin, successful bidders departing with their new companions to begin whatever arrangements they'd negotiate. The remaining women grew more subdued, understanding that their position grew weaker with each passing moment. When Mayor Caldwell finally called Opal's name, a murmur rippled through the remaining crowd. Here was a woman whose best years were clearly behind her, whose value in this marketplace was questionable at best. She climbed the platform with quiet dignity, her chin raised not in defiance, but in simple refusal to be ashamed of who she was. "Mrs. Fairweather is known to you all," the mayor began, his tone respectful but lacking enthusiasm. "A fine woman who served our community well, seeking companionship in her golden years." The silence stretched uncomfortable and long. A few older men shifted nervously, but no hands raised, no voices called out bids. Opal stood perfectly still, her hands folded, watching the crowd with the same calm attention she'd once used to gauge the progress of difficult labors or the chances of patients too far gone to save. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rang clear and strong. $100. Every head turned. Tobias McKenna stood with his hat in his hands, his weathered face serious but not grim, his eyes fixed steadily on Opal rather than the shocked faces surrounding him. "Did you say $100? Mayor Caldwell's voice cracked slightly. "I did." The crowd found its voice then. Gasps, whispers, a few nervous laughs. $100 was more than most men paid for prime horseflesh, certainly more than anyone expected to hear bid for a 70-year-old widow. "Any other bids?" The mayor's question was perfunctory. Everyone knew no one else would match such an offer. Tobias stepped forward, his payment ready, a leather pouch that clinked softly, with the weight of gold nuggets he'd spent years collecting from mountain streams. "I want the 70-year-old woman," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd. And in that moment, watching this mountain man whose reputation for solitude was legendary, Opal felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The recognition of being truly seen, not as society defined her worth, but as the person she actually was. The leather pouch landed on the makeshift table beside the auction block with a solid thunk that seemed to echo in the stunned silence. Gold nuggets spilled slightly from its mouth, catching the afternoon sunlight and throwing tiny rainbows across. The weathered wood, each piece represented months of solitary work, panning mountain streams and following veins through granite that fought every strike of his pick. "Well, I'll be," Mayor Caldwell muttered, hefting the pouch to gauge its weight. The gold was real, substantial, more than enough to cover the bid, and then some. "Mr. McKenna, are you certain about this decision?" Tobias stepped closer to the platform, his boots solid on the packed earth. "Never been more certain of anything in my life." The crowd erupted. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, pressed her handkerchief to her lips as if witnessing something scandalous. "Has he lost his mind completely?" she whispered loud enough for half the square to hear. "Mountain living does things." "To a man," replied Porter Jameson, the blacksmith. "Too much solitude ain't healthy." "Look at all those young girls he passed by," added Tom Fletcher, shaking his head. "Girls who could give him sons, keep his house proper. What's he want with an old woman?" But Tobias heard none of the commentary. His attention remained fixed on Opal, who stood perfectly still on the platform, her face a study in controlled composure. He could see the questions in her eyes, the confusion mixed with something that might have been hope if she dared allow herself such a dangerous emotion. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat completely and holding it against his chest, "would you be willing to come with me?" For a long moment Opal studied this mountain man, who just paid more for her companionship than most men spent on land. His face was weathered by wind and sun, marked by lines that spoke of squinting into distant horizons and enduring weather that would send softer men running for shelter. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that reminded her of winter sky, held something she recognized, not pity, not charity, but genuine respect. "I suppose I would," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed square. The formalities that followed passed in a blur of paperwork and witnessed signatures. Mayor Caldwell, clearly uncomfortable with the unusual transaction, nonetheless performed his duties with bureaucratic efficiency. The marriage certificate, a simple document that would legally bind them, was signed with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. "You have 1 hour to collect your belongings," the mayor informed Opal, consulting his pocket watch. "Town ordinance requires new arrangements to be concluded before sundown." Opal nodded, stepping down from the platform with dignity intact. Several women from the ladies' auxiliary immediately surrounded her, their faces mixing concern with barely concealed excitement at being part of such unexpected drama. "Opal, dear, are you quite sure about this?" fretted Mrs. Pemberton, whose own husband had died only months before. "You don't know anything about this man's intentions." "His intentions seem clear enough," Opal replied, smoothing her skirts. "He's offered me a home and partnership. That's more consideration than I've received from this town in 23 years of widowhood." The truth in her words stung, and several of the women looked away. They'd been content to let Opal manage on her own, accepting her services when they needed healing or help with difficult births, but never offering the kind of practical support that would have made her life easier. While Opal packed her few possessions, clothing, her mother's china teapot, the recipe book filled with remedies and treatments she'd collected over decades of frontier doctoring, Tobias endured the scrutiny of every man still lingering in the square. "You could have had young Mary Hutchinson," said Doc Miller, who served as the town's veterinarian and sometime physician. "Pretty girl, good childbearing hips would have given you a proper family." "I'm not looking for children at my age," Tobias replied evenly. "I'm looking for a partner." "Partner?" This from James Morrison, who owned the largest ranch outside town. "What kind of partnership you planning with a woman her age? She's past useful work, past—" He caught himself before saying something truly crude, but his meaning was clear. Tobias's voice remained calm, but his eyes turned cold. Mrs. Fairweather nursed the entire Murphy mining camp through cholera in '51, single-handed, kept 40 men alive when everyone else had given them up for dead. She delivered half the children in this county and laid out the other half when their time came. Any man who thinks that's not useful work has never tried to do it himself." The group fell silent, reminded suddenly of services they'd taken for. Granted, of times their own families had benefited from Opal's knowledge and steady hands. It was easier to dismiss an old woman's worth when you didn't think about what you'd lose without her. Opal emerged from her small house, carrying a worn carpet bag and the wooden crate that held her most precious possessions. Tobias immediately moved to take both, handling them with the same careful attention he showed his tools and equipment. "That's everything?" he asked. She nodded, then paused. "There is one thing." She pulled her wedding ring from her pocket, the gold band catching the late afternoon light. For a moment, she held it in her palm. 37 years of marriage and 23 years of widowhood, weighing no more than a few grams of metal. Then she slipped it onto her right hand instead of her left. "Some things you don't leave behind," she said simply. "They just find new places." Tobias's expression softened. "I understand." As they prepared to leave, the crowd pressed closer, unwilling to let such drama conclude without final commentary. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at seeing the mysterious mountain man up close. Teenage boys whispered among themselves, already crafting stories they'd tell for years about the day someone paid $100 for the oldest woman at auction. "You sure about this, Opal?" called out Sarah Mitchell, genuine concern in her voice. "It's a hard life up in those mountains. Lonely. What if—" She didn't finish the question, but everyone understood. What if he turned out to be cruel? What if isolation had twisted him in ways that wouldn't show until too late? Opal looked at the faces surrounding her, people she'd known for decades, who'd accepted her help but never offered real friendship, who'd let her grow old alone while deciding her fate required their intervention. Then she looked at Tobias, this stranger who'd seen something in her worth a fortune in gold. "Sometimes," she said clearly, "the greatest risk is not taking one." As Tobias helped her into his wagon, his touch was gentle but sure, the hands of a man accustomed to handling precious things carefully. The wagon itself was solidly built, designed for mountain roads that would test inferior construction. Everything about it spoke of someone who planned ahead, who understood that in harsh country, quality meant survival. The crowd watched as they drove slowly down Main Street, past the general store and the church, past the houses where Opal had spent so many years living on the edges of other people's lives. At the town boundary, where the road began its climb toward the mountains, Tobias stopped the wagon and turned to look at her. "Second thoughts?" he asked. Opal gazed back at Clearwater, already growing small behind them, then ahead to the mountains that had always seemed like distant guardians of secrets she'd never expected to learn. "No," she said firmly, "no second thoughts at all." And as the wagon resumed its journey toward the high country, neither of them saw the way the townspeople continued watching until they disappeared entirely, or how several of the women wiped their eyes, perhaps recognizing too late that they'd let someone rare slip away. The mountain road proved every bit as challenging as Opal had expected. What had seemed like a reasonable path from town quickly became a series of switchbacks carved into steep slopes, where one wrong move would send wagon and passengers tumbling into ravines that seemed to have no bottom. Tobias handled the team with quiet expertise, his attention divided between reading the terrain ahead and monitoring his passengers' comfort. After 2 hours of climbing, Opal's hands ached from gripping the wagon's seat. Her back, which had been giving her trouble for months, now protested every jolt and bounce with sharp reminders of her 70 years. But she kept her discomfort to herself, understanding instinctively that this man would respect stoic endurance more than complaints. "There's a watering spot ahead," Tobias said, the first words he'd spoken since leaving town. "Good place to rest the horses and stretch." The clearing he chose sat beside a mountain stream that chattered over smooth stones, clear water reflecting. Stands of aspen, whose leaves whispered secrets to the evening breeze. Tobias helped her down from the wagon with the same careful attention he'd shown earlier, his hands strong and steady, but never presumptuous. "Beautiful country," Opal observed, settling onto a fallen log that made a natural bench. "It is." He moved to tend the horses, loosening harnesses and checking their legs with the thoroughness of someone who understood that in remote country, a lame horse could mean death. "Takes getting used to, though. The quiet can be overwhelming for folks accustomed to town sounds." Opal listened to the stream's music, the rustle of wind through leaves, the distant call of a hawk riding thermals above peaks that caught the last gold of sunlight. "I think I might like the quiet." Something in her tone made him pause in his work. "You might, at that." As they resumed their journey, the path became even steeper, winding through stands of pine and fir that filled the evening air with their sharp, clean scent. Opal found herself watching Tobias more closely, noting how he read the country around them. A glance at sky to gauge weather, attention to how the horses responded to changes in elevation, awareness of every sound that might signal trouble ahead. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. 18 years, come October." His answer carried the precision of someone who marked time carefully. "Built the cabin the first winter, nearly didn't survive learning how much wood it really takes to heat a place through mountain cold." "What brought you to the mountains?" The question hung between them for several minutes, and Opal began to think he wouldn't answer. Then, just as she was about to apologize for prying, he spoke. "Sometimes a man needs to learn who he is when nobody's watching. Takes a while to strip away all the things other people expect you to be and find what's actually left." The honesty in his words surprised her. She'd expected polite deflection, the kind of careful answers men gave when they didn't want to reveal too much too soon. Instead, he'd offered her something real, a glimpse of the thinking that had driven him to solitude. "And did you learn who you are?" "Thought I had." He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "Recent events suggest I might have been wrong." Full darkness had fallen by the time they reached his cabin, but moonlight silvered the clearing enough to show Opal the scope of what this man had built with his own hands. The structure rose from the landscape as if it belonged there. Log walls, fitted so precisely that chinking was barely visible. A stone chimney that spoke of long winters and careful preparation. A covered porch ran the length of the front wall, complete with chairs positioned to catch morning sun and evening breezes. "It's lovely," she said, meaning it. Tobias lit a lantern inside the cabin, revealing a single large room dominated by the stone fireplace she'd glimpsed from outside. The carved mantelpiece drew her eye immediately, scenes of mountain wildlife rendered with surprising delicacy and skill. A kitchen area occupied one corner, complete with a wood stove and shelving that held the basic necessities of bachelor cooking. A bed stood along the far wall, neatly made with wool blankets, while a smaller cot had been set up near the fireplace. "I've arranged sleeping quarters," he said, nodding toward the cot. "You'll have privacy, and the fireplace will keep you warm." The thoughtfulness of the arrangement touched her more than elaborate courtesy might have. He'd considered her comfort and dignity, preparing for her arrival with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "Thank you." She set down her carpet bag and looked around the space that would now be her home. Everything was scrupulously clean, organized with military precision, but utterly masculine. No curtains softened the windows. No decorative touches warmed the functional furniture. It was the home of someone who'd forgotten that living and merely surviving weren't the same thing. "Are you hungry?" Tobias was already moving toward the kitchen area. "I've got venison stew from yesterday, biscuits that are only slightly stale. I could eat something." She followed him, noting how he moved through the space with efficient economy. "May I help?" He paused, ladle half raised. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'd like to. Cooking for one person never feels quite right." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition of shared experience. "I suppose it doesn't." Working together in the small kitchen space required coordination, awareness of the other person's movements and needs. Opal heated biscuits while Tobias served stew, and she found herself noting small things, how he automatically handed her utensils, how he'd already learned to accommodate her shorter reach when setting things on high shelves. They ate by lamplight, conversation limited but not uncomfortable. The stew was well seasoned and substantial, the biscuits better than he'd claimed. This was the cooking of someone who understood that good food mattered even when eating alone. "The mantelpiece," Opal said eventually. "Did you carve that yourself?" "Long. Winter project. Keeps your hands busy when there's nothing else to do." She studied the intricate scenes, elk grazing in meadows, bears fishing mountain streams, and eagles soaring above peaks that looked remarkably like the ones surrounding them. "You're quite skilled. Practice. When you've got 18 winters to fill, you find ways to pass time." After they'd cleaned up, Tobias banked the fire and prepared for sleep with the efficient routine of someone long accustomed to solitude. But tonight felt different, charged with the awareness of another presence, another breathing person, sharing space that had known only silence for so long. "Good night, Mrs. Fairweather. Good night, Mr. McKenna." Lying on the cot, listening to the small sounds of the cabin settling and the whisper of wind through pines, Opal reflected on the remarkable day that had brought her here. 12 hours ago, she'd been a charity case in Clearwater, tolerated but not valued. Now she was a partner in an arrangement she didn't yet understand, in a place beautiful enough to break her heart. In his bed across the room, Tobias lay awake. As well, hyper-aware of the soft sound of feminine breathing, the rustle of fabric as she shifted in sleep. For 18 years, the cabin had been his private sanctuary. Tonight, it felt like something else entirely, the beginning of a story he'd never dared imagine he might write. Opal woke before dawn to the sound of Tobias moving quietly through morning preparations. Stoking the fire, putting coffee on to boil, the soft creak of floorboards under careful feet. She lay still, listening to the rhythm of someone who'd perfected the art of solitary living, and wondered how her presence would change patterns 18 years in the making. "Morning," he said when she finally stirred. "Coffee's ready if you want some." The coffee was strong enough to float horseshoes, dark and bitter in the way of men who valued function over flavor. But it was hot and welcome, and Opal wrapped her, hands around the tin cup, grateful for its warmth against the mountain morning's chill. "What does a typical day look like up here?" she asked. "Depends on the season. Summer means tending the garden, preserving food for winter, maintaining the cabin and outbuildings. Got trap lines to check, hunting when meat runs low, always something needs doing." She nodded, recognizing the self-sufficient rhythm of frontier life. "I'd like to help. I'm not afraid of work." "Didn't figure you were." He studied her over his coffee cup. "But mountain work is different from town work. Harder on the body, more consequence for mistakes." "I understand." She pulled her recipe book from her carpet bag, its water-stained pages soft from years of use. "I brought something that might prove useful." Tobias accepted the notebook with careful hands, turning pages that revealed decades of accumulated knowledge. Remedies for fever and infection, instructions for setting bones, recipes for preserving food, and treating everything from colic to consumption. The margins were filled with notes in Opal's careful handwriting, modifications based on experience, updates when better methods proved themselves. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "You documented all of this yourself. Most of it came from my mother and grandmother, but I've added what I've learned over the years. Mountain country must have its own challenges. Different plants, different problems. I'd like to learn them." He closed the book and handed it back with evident respect. "I'd be grateful for your knowledge. Been lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever, and I'm a day's hard ride from the nearest doctor." After breakfast, Tobias began showing her around the homestead with the thoroughness of someone conducting an important inventory. The garden produced vegetables she recognized, and others adapted to high-altitude growing. Root cellars kept food fresh through seasons when hunting might fail. A workshop held tools maintained with the precision of instruments, everything organized for maximum efficiency. But it was in the small barn where Opal noticed something that made her pause. Tobias was examining one of his horses, running experienced hands down legs and checking hooves with the attention of someone who understood that animals were partners, not just property. When he straightened, though, she caught the slight grimace that crossed his face. "Your back troubles you," she observed. He stiffened slightly. "Nothing serious. May I look?" "That's not necessary, Mr. McKenna." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades convincing stubborn patients to accept help they needed. "I've treated more back injuries than I can count." "Pride won't make it better." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. In the cabin, with morning light streaming through windows, Opal examined old injuries with hands that had learned to read pain through touch. His back showed the accumulated damage of hard living, muscles knotted from sleeping on ground too many nights, joints stiffened by cold and overuse, scars that spoke of accidents survived through luck and determination. When did this happen? She pressed gently at a particularly tight knot. 3 winters back, fell through ice crossing a stream, had to crawl half a mile before I could stand again. Her hands worked steadily, finding tensions and releasing them with techniques learned from an old German woman who'd understood that healing required both knowledge and intuition. "You've been managing pain for years." "Comes with the territory, doesn't have to." She reached for her recipe book, finding pages devoted to treatments for muscle and joint problems. "I can make liniments that will help, show you stretches that prevent the worst of it." As she worked, Tobias gradually relaxed under her ministrations, the wariness that seemed his natural state giving way to something approaching trust. "Where did you learn this?" "Necessity. When you're the only person for miles who knows how to treat injury, you learn fast, or people die." Her hands found another knot and worked it patiently. "My first husband thought doctoring was unnatural for a woman. Took him years to understand that frontier life doesn't respect such opinions. Your first husband was a fool." The words were spoken quietly, without heat, but with absolute conviction. Opal's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. He was a good man in many ways, just couldn't see past what he'd been taught to expect. And yet you stayed. Love makes people endure things they shouldn't have to endure. She finished her treatment and stepped back. "Try moving around. The improvement should be immediate, and it'll get better over the coming days." Tobias rotated his shoulders, bent carefully at the waist, moved in ways that had been painful for months. The relief in his expression was unmistakable. "That's remarkable." He straightened fully for the first time in recent memory. "How long? Will it last?" "With proper care, the improvement should be permanent, but you'll need to maintain it. Exercises, regular treatment, better attention to how you sleep and work." "You'd be willing to help with that?" Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. This wasn't just about medical treatment. It was about trust, about letting someone care for him in ways he'd clearly avoided for years. Of course. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Opal contributing vegetables and herbs from her knowledge, Tobias providing meat and basic cooking skills, the atmosphere between them had shifted. The careful politeness of strangers was giving way to something more comfortable. the beginning of partnership based on mutual respect and complementary strengths. "Tell me about the mining camp," Tobias said, as they sat down to eat. "The one you saved," Opal considered her words carefully. "Copper Ridge. Winter of 1851 was the worst anyone could remember. Supply trains couldn't get through. Men were dying from cold and sickness faster than they could dig graves. The mine superintendent had already fled south. But you stayed. I had a baby not yet weaned and nowhere else to go. So I did what needed doing." She met his eyes across the small table. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just refuse to give up. And sometimes," Tobias said thoughtfully, "the smartest thing you can do is recognize real courage when you see it." Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant conversations, and inside the cabin, two people who'd spent too many years alone began the careful process of learning they might not have to be alone anymore. The storm began building on their fourth day together, starting as wisps of clouds that clung to the highest peaks before spreading downward like fingers reaching into the valleys. Tobias watched the sky with the attention of someone who'd learned to read weather's moods through painful experience. "We'll need to bring in extra firewood," he told Opal as they finished morning coffee. "This one's going to be a siege." By noon, the first fat snowflakes were falling, and by evening, the world beyond the cabin windows had disappeared into a white void of wind and driving snow. Tobias moved through storm preparations with practiced efficiency, securing outbuildings, bringing animals into shelter, checking the root cellar's storm access. He'd built this homestead to survive mountain weather at its worst, but he'd always weathered such storms alone. The storm shelter he'd constructed years before proved its worth, as wind began to howl around the cabin with the voice of something wild and hungry. Built into the hillside behind the main structure, it was more than a simple root cellar. It was a reinforced sanctuary stocked with food, water, and supplies sufficient to outlast the longest mountain siege. "Impressive," Opal observed as Tobias lit lanterns in the underground space. Shelves lined the walls, holding preserved foods, medical supplies, tools, and ammunition. A small stove provided heat, while carefully designed ventilation prevented the build-up of dangerous gases. "Man learns to prepare for the worst when he's seen what the worst looks like," Tobias replied, banking coals that would keep them warm through the night. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them in forced intimacy that neither had anticipated. During daylight hours, they maintained careful routines, Tobias working on equipment maintenance while Opal organized supplies and prepared meals. But in the long evening hours, with wind screaming outside and lamplight creating a circle of warmth in the underground shelter, conversation became their primary entertainment. "Tell me about before," Opal said on the second night, when the storm's fury seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. "What brought you to this life?" Tobias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the stove's glowing coals, he began to speak. "I was married once, had a farm in Kansas, good land, decent house. Sarah was—" He paused, searching for words. "She was everything a young man thinks he wants. Beautiful, charming, from a good family." Opal waited, recognizing the careful way he was choosing his words. "Took me 5 years to understand that charm and character aren't the same thing. Sarah was bored by farming, by me, by the quiet life we were building. Found her comfort elsewhere, with men who offered excitement I couldn't provide." The pain in his voice was old, but still sharp, like a scar that ached in cold weather. When I confronted her, she laughed, said I was a fool to expect fidelity from someone like her, that she'd married me for security, not love. The whole town knew, had been talking behind my back for months. So you left, burned the farm rather than let her profit from selling it, headed west with what I could carry and never looked back." He glanced at her. "Sounds bitter when I say it out loud. Sounds like a man who learned a hard lesson about trust. Maybe too hard. Spent 18 years assuming that disappointment was inevitable, that solitude was safer than connection." He stirred the coals absently. Recent events suggest that might have been an overcorrection. On the third night, when the storm's intensity had them both wondering if the cabin above might blow away entirely, Tobias fell ill with a fever that struck suddenly and hard. One moment he was checking the stove's dampers, the next he was swaying on his feet, face flushed with heat that had nothing to do with the underground shelter's warmth. "Sit down," Opal commanded, recognizing the signs. Immediately, she pressed her hand to his forehead, feeling heat that spoke of infection fighting his system. "When did you last have a proper bath? Change clothes?" "Week, maybe 2. His voice was thick, consciousness already becoming unreliable. "Don't see the point when—" "The point is preventing exactly this." She was already moving, gathering supplies, her mind shifting into the focused clarity that had served her through decades of medical crises. Mountain living doesn't exempt you from basic hygiene. What followed was a night of careful nursing that reminded Opal why she'd become indispensable to frontier communities. She managed his fever with cool cloths and herbal teas, monitored his breathing when congestion threatened his lungs, and stayed awake through the long hours when sickness makes its final claim or releases its grip. Tobias was delirious for hours, muttering fragments of memory and regret, apologies to people long gone, arguments with ghosts, moments of clarity where he seemed surprised to find her there. "Sarah," he mumbled at one point, his hand reaching toward her face. "No," Opal said gently, catching his hand and holding it steady. "It's Opal. You're safe." His eyes focused on her with effort. "Opal, the woman worth $100. The woman taking care of you, yes, don't deserve—" "Hush. What people deserve and what they get rarely match up. Rest now." By dawn, his fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. He woke to find Opal dozing in the chair beside his makeshift bed, her recipe book open on her lap, evidence of the long night she'd spent monitoring his condition. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse but lucid. "Since yesterday evening. You gave me quite a scare." He tried to sit up, discovered his body had other ideas, and settled back against the pillows she'd arranged. "You stayed awake all night." "Of course I did. That's what partners do." The word hung between them, loaded with implications neither had fully acknowledged before this moment. Partners. Not a business arrangement, not a convenient solution to mutual loneliness, but something approaching actual partnership. "I could have died," he said quietly, "but you didn't, and even if you had, you wouldn't have died alone." She closed the recipe book and set it aside. Sometimes that's the most important thing, knowing someone will stay with you through the worst of it. When they emerged from the storm shelter the next morning, the world had been transformed into something crystalline and impossibly beautiful. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the clearing, sculpted by wind into patterns that caught and threw back. The morning light. The cabin had survived intact, its solid construction proving itself against mountain weather at its most savage. But more than the landscape had been transformed. As they worked together to dig out from the storm, Tobias moving carefully due to lingering weakness, Opal directing operations with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises, they moved with the coordination of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. "Thank you," Tobias said, as they paused to rest from shoveling, "for staying, for taking care of me, for—" He gestured helplessly, unable to find words for the gift she'd given him. "For treating you like someone worth saving." Opal finished gently. "That's not kindness, Tobias. That's just recognition of what's true." Standing in the snow-bright clearing, surrounded by the quiet that follows storms, they looked at each other with new understanding. What had begun as a mutually beneficial arrangement was becoming something neither had expected. The foundation of genuine affection built on mutual respect and the knowledge that some people were worth the risk of caring. 3 weeks after the storm, the sound of approaching horses shattered the mountain quiet that had become their private world. Tobias reached for his rifle with the instinctive wariness of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. while Opal moved to the window to peer through curtains she'd sewn from fabric salvaged from old clothes. 4 riders, she reported quietly. Town clothes, not mountain gear. The delegation from Clearwater arrived with all the pomp they could muster at the end of a difficult mountain ride. Mayor Caldwell led the group, flanked by Reverend Morrison, Doc Miller, and, surprisingly, Mrs. Henderson from the Ladies' Auxiliary. Their horses were lathered from the climb, and their city shoes slipped on snow-packed ground as they dismounted. "Mr. McKenna," the mayor called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "We need to speak with you." And with Mrs. He paused, unsure of how to address Opal's changed status. "Mrs. McKenna," Opal said firmly, stepping onto the porch. She hadn't legally changed her name, but something in the way Tobias straightened at her words told her the claim was welcome. "Yes, well." Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We've come on official business regarding your arrangement." Tobias emerged from the cabin, rifle conspicuously visible, but not directly threatening. What business would that be? Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his thin face pinched with disapproval. "The business of Christian decency, Mr. McKenna. This situation has caused considerable scandal in town. A proper marriage should have been celebrated in God's house, not concluded at a mercantile auction." "The marriage was legal," Tobias replied evenly. Mayor Caldwell himself performed the ceremony and filed the papers. Legal, perhaps, but hardly proper. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to defining propriety for others. "People are talking, Mr. McKenna, about the unseemly nature of your arrangement, the advanced age of your wife, and the spectacle you made of our community gathering." Opal felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "And what exactly are they saying, Mrs. Henderson?" "That you were desperate enough to accept any offer, regardless of its propriety. That Mr. McKenna has taken advantage of your circumstances for purposes that—" She stopped, apparently realizing she was approaching territory even her boldness couldn't safely navigate. "For purposes that what?" Opal's tone carried a warning that made even the Reverend shift uncomfortably. Doc Miller, who'd remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Look, we're not here to cause trouble, but the town has standards, and this situation reflects poorly on all of us. People are questioning whether proper Christian values are being observed in arrangements like this." "Proper Christian values," Tobias repeated slowly, "like letting a woman who served your community for decades grow old alone because no one could see past her age to her worth." The accusation hung in the cold air, and several members of the delegation had the grace to look uncomfortable. They'd all benefited from Opal's services over the years, births she'd attended, illnesses she'd treated, crises she'd helped resolve, but gratitude and respect, apparently, were different things. "That's not," Mayor Caldwell began. "It's exactly the point," Opal interrupted. "For 23 years, I've been available whenever your community needed healing or help. But when it came time for me to need something, companionship, security, a home, suddenly my worthiness became questionable." "Mrs. Fair, McKenna." Reverend Morrison's voice took on the patronizing tone he used for difficult parishioners. "No one questions your service to the community, but surely you understand that appearances matter. A woman of your age entering into such an arrangement—" "Such an arrangement?" Tobias's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You mean a legal marriage between 2 consenting adults? A marriage of convenience that makes a mockery of the sacred institution, Reverend." The single word from Tobias carried enough menace to silence the clergyman mid-sentence. "You're guests on my land, speaking about my wife. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." The tension stretched taut as mountain air before Doc Miller stepped forward, apparently designated as the voice of reason. "What we're trying to say is that the community would like to see this situation regularized, a proper church wedding, public acknowledgement of the union, integration back into town society." "And if we refuse?" Opal asked. Then you'll remain outcasts, Mrs. Henderson said bluntly. Cut off from civilized society, subjects of gossip and speculation. Is that really how you want to spend your remaining years? The threat was clear enough, though dressed in the language of social concern. Conform to their expectations, or face permanent exclusion from the community that had shaped both their lives. Tobias moved closer to Opal, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of solidarity. And what does this regularization require exactly? A proper ceremony in the church, Reverend Morrison said, apparently taking their questions as agreement. Public vows, community celebration, a chance for everyone to see that this union has God's blessing and the town's approval. In other words, Opal said quietly, a chance for you to turn our private commitment into public theater for your entertainment. Mrs. McKenna, Mayor Caldwell's tone attempted diplomacy. We're offering you a path back to respectability. Surely you can see the benefit of pretending our marriage is only valid if you approve it. Tobias's patience was clearly approaching its limits. The benefit of performing for people who treated my wife as disposable until they discovered she was married to someone with gold? Now see here, Mrs. Henderson began. No, you see here. Opal stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority that had once convinced 40 miners to trust her judgment. I spent decades serving a community that took my help for granted and gave nothing back. I won't spend whatever years I have left seeking approval from people who've never valued me as anything more than a convenience. She looked at each member of the delegation in turn. You rode up here in winter risking dangerous travel to tell us we're not respectable enough for your standards, but you never made such an effort to visit when I was alone and could have used companionship. You never organized delegations to ensure my welfare or security. Your concern for my reputation is remarkably recent. Mrs. McKenna, Reverend Morrison tried again. I'm not finished. Her voice cut across his protest. You want to know about proper Christian values? The Bible speaks of treating strangers with kindness, of caring for widows and the elderly, of not judging others by worldly standards. Where were those values when I needed them most? The delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances. Apparently, not having expected such direct confrontation from the woman they'd come to rescue from her own poor judgment. We understand you're emotional about this, Doc Miller said carefully, but isolation can affect people's thinking. Perhaps if you came back to town for a visit, spent time with other women, you might see things differently. My thinking is perfectly clear, Doctor. Clear enough to recognize that your concern has nothing to do with my welfare and everything to do with your discomfort with choices that don't fit your narrow expectations. Tobias moved to stand beside her, his presence a silent declaration of support. I think you've said your piece. Time for you to leave. Mr. McKenna, please reconsider. Mayor Caldwell made one final attempt. The town is prepared to welcome you both back into civilized society. All we ask is proper acknowledgement of social conventions. And all we ask, Opal replied, is to be left alone to live the life we've chosen. If that's too much for your conventions to bear, then perhaps the problem lies with the conventions, not with us. After the delegation's departure, the cabin felt different. Not violated exactly, but somehow smaller, as if the outside world had pressed closer to their private sanctuary. Opal busied herself with evening preparations while Tobias secured the property with extra attention, both of them processing the confrontation in their own ways. It was while gathering her recipe book from where it had fallen during the afternoon's tension that Opal noticed the loose board in the cabin's floor. Tobias was outside checking on the animals, and she knelt to examine what appeared to be a carefully concealed hiding place beneath the planking. Find what you're looking for. Tobias's voice from the doorway made her start. I wasn't looking for anything. This board was loose, and I thought you should know before someone trips. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts, but something in his expression made her pause. Tobias? He crossed to where she stood and knelt beside the loose board. working it free with practiced movements that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd accessed whatever lay beneath. What emerged was a small wooden box, carefully wrapped in oiled, a cloth to protect it from moisture. "I suppose you should see this," he said, though his tone suggested he'd rather avoid whatever revelation was coming. Inside the box were papers, legal documents, correspondence, and what appeared to be a deed of some kind. Opal accepted them with growing confusion, her eyes scanning language that became increasingly familiar as she read. "Copper Ridge Mining Claim," she read aloud. "Property of Samuel Fairweather, transferred upon death to his lawful wife, Opal Fairweather." She looked up at Tobias with growing comprehension. "You knew. Not when I bid on you. Not then." His voice was quiet, carefully controlled. "I found the deed among your things the first night, when I was putting your carpetbag away. It had fallen out, and I couldn't help but see." The papers rustled in her trembling hands as the full implications struck her. The Copper Ridge claim had been thought worthless for decades, abandoned after the initial surface deposits played out. But recent mining techniques had made deeper extraction profitable, and claims that had seemed valueless were suddenly worth fortunes. "How long have you known what this is worth?" 2 weeks. I rode to town after the storm, made inquiries. The mining company has been trying to locate the heir to the Copper Ridge claim for months. Apparently, there's enough silver in those hills to make someone very wealthy. Opal sank into a chair, her mind reeling. "And you said nothing." What was I supposed to say? That I'd accidentally discovered you were potentially worth more money than most people see in a lifetime? That our arrangement might look like calculated fortune hunting rather than... He stopped, apparently realizing he was about to say something he wasn't ready to voice. Rather than what, Tobias? Rather than a man recognizing something precious that everyone else had overlooked. The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache, but doubt had taken root with the tenacity of mountain weeds. "How do I know that's true? How do I know you didn't somehow learn about this claim before the auction? Because if I'd known, I would never have bid on you." The answer was so unexpected, so contrary to what she'd feared, that it stopped her. Suspicions cold. "What?" Tobias moved to the window, staring out at mountains that held their secrets as closely as he held his own. "I've spent 18 years proving I don't need anyone's money, anyone's help, anyone's approval. If I'd known you had wealth, I would have seen it as a complication I couldn't afford. I would have let some other man bid, convinced myself I was being noble by not taking advantage. But you did know for weeks, and you said nothing. You let me believe." She stopped, unsure exactly what she had believed, but certain it was simpler than the truth now revealing itself. "I let you believe we were building something real, based on who we actually are, rather than what we might gain from each other, because that's what I wanted to believe too." The deed lay between them on the rough wooden table, its legal language, transforming their entire relationship with a few paragraphs of careful script. Everything that had seemed genuine now carried the taint of potential calculation. Every kindness suspect, every shared moment reframed by the possibility of ulterior motives. "The town delegation," Opal said slowly. "They don't know about this. Not yet, but they will soon enough. Claims like this don't stay secret long, and when word gets out..." He turned from the window, his expression grim. "When word gets out, we'll have more visitors than just disappointed church committees." As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple horses approaching echoed across the clearing. But these weren't townspeople on a social call. These were riders moving with purpose, their horses fresh despite the mountain terrain, their gear speaking of serious business rather than casual visits. "Opal McKenna," the lead rider called out before dismounting. He was a small, neat man in expensive clothes that had somehow managed to survive mountain travel without wrinkle or stain. "My name is Vernon Hayes, representing the Consolidated Mining Corporation. I believe we have business to discuss." Behind him, 3 other men deployed with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to difficult negotiations. One remained mounted, watching the tree line. Another positioned himself where he could observe both the cabin and the approaching trail. The third began unloading surveying equipment and document cases that suggested this visit would be lengthy and official. "What kind of business?" Tobias asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "The kind that makes people wealthy, Mr. McKenna. Very wealthy indeed." Hayes smiled with the confidence of someone holding winning cards. "We understand your wife has inherited certain mining rights that have recently become quite valuable. We're prepared to make an offer that would secure your family's future for generations." Opal stood in the cabin doorway, watching this scene unfold with the growing certainty that their quiet mountain life was about to be shattered beyond repair. The deed that had seemed like a bridge between past and future was becoming the fault line along which their newfound happiness would split apart. "And if we're not interested in selling?" she asked. Hayes's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Mrs. McKenna, I think you'll find our offer very interesting indeed, particularly when you consider the alternatives." The implied threat hung in the mountain air like smoke from a distant fire, promising complications that would test everything she and Tobias had built together. The mining corporation had come prepared for negotiation, but their preparation suggested they were equally ready for less pleasant means of persuasion. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside," Tobias said carefully. "Mountain evenings can be cold, and this sounds like a conversation that might take some time." As the mining company representatives filed into the cabin, their presence filling the space that had been sanctuary, Opal caught Tobias's eye across the room. In that look, she saw her own questions reflected. How much of what they'd found together was real, and how much would survive the truth that was about to reshape everything they thought they knew about each other? The deed lay on the table where she'd placed it, no longer a piece of family history, but the catalyst that would determine whether their partnership was strong enough to survive external pressure and internal doubt. Outside, darkness was falling across the mountains, and with it came the understanding that their simple life together had just become infinitely more complicated. Vernon Hayes spread maps and documents across Tobias's handmade table with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. The Copper Ridge claim, outlined in red ink, encompassed territory that stretched far beyond what Opal had imagined, hundreds of acres of mountainous terrain that the mining corporation had clearly studied in considerable detail. "As you can see, Mrs. McKenna, your late husband's claim covers some of the most promising mineral deposits in the territory," Hayes explained, his finger tracing boundaries that seemed to encompass half the visible landscape. "Recent geological surveys indicate silver reserves that could produce for decades, possibly generations." Opal studied the maps with the careful attention she'd once brought to medical diagnoses, looking for details that might reveal more than the speaker intended. "And you're certain these surveys are accurate?" "Absolutely certain. We've invested considerable resources in exploration, including preliminary excavation that has exceeded our most optimistic projections." Hayes's smile had the practiced warmth of someone selling salvation. "Which brings us to our offer." The figure he wrote on a piece of paper and slid across the table was enough to make Opal's breath catch. More money than she'd ever imagined. Existing, certainly more than she could spend in several lifetimes. Tobias glanced at the number and showed no reaction, but she noticed his hands tighten slightly where they rested on the table. "That's quite generous," she said carefully. "What exactly would the arrangement involve?" "Complete transfer of mining rights to Consolidated Mining Corporation in exchange for the sum specified, plus a small percentage of future profits as a courtesy gesture," Hayes replied smoothly. "You would be free to live wherever you chose, in whatever style you preferred. No more mountain isolation, no more frontier hardships, a life of comfort and security." "And if we prefer our current life?" Something shifted in Hayes's expression. the warmth becoming slightly less convincing. "Mrs. McKenna, I'm sure you understand that mining operations of this scale require substantial infrastructure. Roads, equipment transport, worker housing. The quiet mountain life you've enjoyed would necessarily change whether you participate in our operation or not." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Accept their offer and relocate voluntarily, or watch their operation destroy the peace they'd found, regardless of their cooperation. "How long do we have to consider your offer?" Tobias asked. "We're prepared to conclude this transaction tonight," Hayes replied. "I have all necessary documents prepared, and my associates can witness the signatures. You could wake tomorrow as one of the wealthiest couples in the territory, and if we need time to discuss this privately..." Hayes consulted an expensive pocket. "Watch with theatrical precision. I suppose we could allow until morning. But Mrs. McKenna, I must emphasize that opportunities like this are rarely offered twice. Consolidated Mining Corporation has other options for acquiring the resources we need, but we prefer to proceed through negotiation rather than alternative methods." After the mining representatives retired to their camp in the clearing, claiming the cabin was too small for their comfort, Opal and Tobias sat in silence that felt heavier than mountain stone. The documents Hayes had left behind covered their table like evidence of a crime not yet committed, legal language that would transform their lives whether they signed or not. "They're not going to accept refusal," Tobias said finally. "No, they're not." Opal stared at the maps that carved up the territory they'd come to love. "And they were prepared for this conversation, which means they've known about the claim longer than they admitted. Long enough to have people watching us, certainly. Long enough to know exactly how much pressure to apply." The implications were disturbing. If the mining corporation had been monitoring their situation, they would know about the town delegation's visit, about the social pressure being applied, about the isolation that made them vulnerable to coercion. "There's something else," Tobias said, moving to the window to check the corporate camp. "Something that's been bothering me since Hayes mentioned preliminary excavation." "What do you mean?" "Copper Ridge is a day's hard ride from here, but it's within sight of the high meadow where I hunt. I've been up there dozens of times over the years, and I've never seen signs of mining activity. No equipment, no survey markers, no excavation." Opal joined him at the window, studying the flickering campfire where their uninvited guests had settled for the night. "You think they're lying about the surveys?" "I think they're lying about something. Question is whether they're exaggerating the claim's value to pressure us into selling or understating it to convince us we're getting a fair price." The uncertainty was maddening. If the claim was genuinely valuable, selling could provide security for whatever years remained to them. If it was essentially worthless, the mining corporation's interest suggested some other motive entirely. But, with no way to verify the truth independently, they were forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and the word of people whose interests directly opposed their own. "There is one way to find out," Opal said slowly. "What's that?" "Ride to Copper Ridge ourselves, see what's actually there." Tobias considered this, weighing the practical difficulties against the potential benefits. "That's rough country, especially with early winter weather, dangerous for someone..." He caught himself before finishing the thought, but Opal knew what he'd almost said. "Dangerous for someone my age?" Her voice carried gentle amusement rather than offense. "I've traveled worse, terrain in worse weather, and I'm probably the only person alive who remembers the exact boundaries Samuel marked when he filed the claim. It would mean leaving Hayes and his people here unsupervised, and staying means negotiating from ignorance while they hold every advantage." She moved away from the window, decision crystallizing with the clarity that had guided her through decades of medical crises. "I need to see what Samuel actually left me, what it's really worth, what these people really want. And if it turns out to be genuinely valuable, then we decide together what that means for our future." The word "together" hung between them, heavy with implications they hadn't fully explored. In the weeks since the auction, they'd built something that felt like partnership, but the mining company's arrival had introduced questions about motivation and trust that couldn't be easily answered. "Opal," Tobias said carefully, "about the deed, about not telling you what I'd discovered." "I know." She turned from the window, meeting his eyes directly. "I know you were protecting something you thought was fragile. The question is whether what we've built is strong enough to survive the truth. And if it isn't, then we'll have learned something important about ourselves and each other." She moved to her recipe book, pulling out the letter she'd written weeks ago but never sent. A letter attempting to explain to her scattered children why she'd made the choices that brought her to this mountain cabin. "But I don't think we're as fragile as we fear." Outside, the mining company's camp settled into the routine of professional travelers. But both Opal and Tobias noticed the way guards had been positioned to watch all approaches to the cabin. Hayes had spoken of generous offers and voluntary cooperation, but his preparations suggested he was ready for less pleasant negotiations. "We leave at first light," Tobias decided, "quietly before they realize we're gone. Can you be ready?" "I've been ready for this conversation since Samuel died," Opal replied. "I just never had reason to make the journey before." As they prepared for sleep, both understood that tomorrow would bring answers that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their situation. The deed that had seemed like a simple inheritance was becoming the key to questions that went far beyond money or mining rights, but more than external mysteries would be resolved by their journey to Copper Ridge. In the harsh country where Samuel Fairweather had staked his claim decades before, Opal and Tobias would finally learn whether their partnership was based on genuine affection or merely mutual convenience, whether trust could survive the revelation of secrets, and whether love was possible between two people who'd spent too many years believing they were past such dreams. The letter Opal had never sent lay open on the table beside the mining maps, her own handwriting stark against the corporate documents. In it, she'd tried to explain to her children why she'd chosen an uncertain future with a stranger over the predictable loneliness of her remaining years. Tomorrow, she would discover whether her explanation was true or whether she'd been deceiving herself about the nature of what she and Tobias had found together in their mountain sanctuary. Dawn came grey and cold, with the kind of mountain silence that makes every sound carry impossible distances. Opal and Tobias moved through their preparations with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to dangerous work, packing supplies and checking equipment while the mining company's camp remained still in the pre-dawn darkness. They left through the back trail, leading their horses until they were well beyond earshot, before mounting and beginning the climb toward Copper Ridge. The terrain was everything Tobias had warned. Steep switchbacks carved into slopes that fell away to valleys too deep to measure. Paths that required absolute trust in horses trained for mountain work. But Opal found herself remembering this country, recognizing landmarks that had been hidden by decades of changed perspective. Here was the lightning-struck pine, where Samuel had carved their initials during their first year of marriage. There was the overlook where he'd shown her the claim boundaries, young and optimistic, and certain that hard work would make them wealthy. "How much farther?" Tobias asked as they paused to rest the horses. "Another hour, maybe less." Opal studied the ridgeline ahead, memory and present landscape slowly aligning. "Samuel used to say you could smell the silver in the rocks up here, though I never noticed anything but pine and granite." The final approach to Copper Ridge revealed a landscape that bore no resemblance to the active mining operation Hayes had described. No roads scarred the mountainsides. No equipment lay abandoned from recent surveys. Instead, they found only the weathered remnants of Samuel's original excavation. A shallow tunnel carved into granite, hand tools rusted beyond use, the skeletal remains of a sluice box that had once washed hope from mountain streams. "Preliminary excavation," Tobias said dryly, examining what was clearly decades-old work. "Either Consolidated Mining has very different standards than I imagined, or they were lying about their survey results." But as Opal explored the claim boundaries Samuel had marked with stone cairns and blazed trees, she found something that made her breath catch. Fresh survey markers recently placed, bearing symbols that meant nothing to her but clearly indicated professional assessment of the property. Someone had been studying this land, but not for the reasons Hayes had claimed. "Tobias," she called, her voice tight with discovery. "You need to see this." He joined her beside what appeared to be a natural spring, clear water bubbling from granite that showed no signs of mineral deposits. But carved into the stone beside the spring, almost hidden by lichen and weather, were symbols that spoke of surveying work far more sophisticated than anything Samuel could have accomplished. "Government markers," Tobias said, recognizing what Opal had found. "This is territorial survey work, probably mapping for railroad routes or territorial boundaries, nothing to do with mining." The implications struck them simultaneously. Consolidated Mining Corporation wasn't interested in silver that didn't exist. They were interested in land that would become valuable for entirely different reasons. "Railroad," Opal said quietly. "They're planning a railroad route through here, which means they need clear title to the land, not mining rights." Tobias studied the survey markers with growing understanding. "If they can convince you to sell mineral rights for a fraction of what the land is actually worth, they get access to the most strategic mountain pass for hundreds of miles, probably for pennies on the dollar compared to what they'd have to pay if I knew the truth." The deception was breathtaking in its scope and cynicism. Hayes and his colleagues had crafted an elaborate fiction about silver deposits and mining operations, counting on her ignorance of territorial development plans and her desperate need for security to make her accept a fraction of her claims. Real value, but more than money, was at stake now. If a railroad came through these mountains, it would transform not just the isolated peaks of Copper Ridge, but the entire region. Their quiet valley, their private sanctuary, their carefully built life together, all of it would disappear under the advance of progress and development. "We have to get back," Opal said, sudden urgency making her voice sharp. "If Hayes realizes we've discovered the truth, he'll stop negotiating and start taking more direct action." Tobias was already moving toward their horses. "Men like that don't accept losing, especially when this much money is involved." The ride back to the cabin took on desperate quality, both of them pushing their mounts as hard as mountain terrain would allow. But even as they descended toward the valley that held their home, smoke was rising from their clearing. Too much smoke, too dark, coming from the wrong direction. They smelled it long before they saw it, the acrid stench of burning books, papers, personal possessions. Hayes and his men had moved beyond negotiation to coercion, destroying anything that might complicate their claim to legitimacy. "The marriage certificate," Opal whispered, understanding immediately what the smoke meant. "They're burning proof of our legal connection, and anything else that might establish your ownership of the claim." Tobias's voice was grim. "Without documentation, it becomes much harder to prove your rights in territorial court." They approached the final ridge overlooking their cabin with the caution of people entering hostile territory. What they saw below confirmed their worst fears. Hayes's men had ransacked the cabin systematically, creating a bonfire from papers, books and personal effects, while Hayes himself directed operations with the satisfaction of someone executing a well-planned strategy. "Mrs. McKenna's recipe book," one of the men called out, adding the water-stained notebook to the flames. "Lot of medical nonsense, but there might be property records hidden in it." Watching decades of accumulated knowledge disappear into smoke, Opal felt something inside herself crystallize into cold fury. These men had invaded her home, destroyed her possessions, and threatened everything she'd built with Tobias, all in service of a lie designed to cheat her of what was rightfully hers. "What's our legal standing?" she asked quietly. "Without the marriage certificate and property deed, significantly weakened, but not hopeless if we can reach territorial authorities before Hayes files competing claims." "And what are the chances of that, realistically?" Tobias studied the scene below, noting the professional efficiency with which Hayes's men had prepared for exactly this contingency. Not good. They've obviously planned this operation carefully, probably have legal documents already prepared, and officials already bribed. Then we don't fight this legally. Opal's voice carried the same calm authority that had once convinced 40 miners to trust her judgment during the worst crisis of their lives. We fight it directly. Opal, these aren't town committee members or church delegations. These are professionals who've done this before, probably many times. They'll have contingencies for resistance. Then it's fortunate, she said, checking the rifle Tobias had insisted she carry, that they're dealing with people who've survived things they can't imagine. The confrontation began at sunset, with Hayes and his men gathered around their bonfire of stolen documents, celebrating what they assumed was complete victory. They'd destroyed the evidence of Opal's legal claim and were preparing to file their own paperwork establishing corporate ownership of the Copper Ridge property. Opal and Tobias approached openly, walking down the familiar path to their own cabin, with the calm deliberation of people who belonged exactly where they were. Hayes looked up from the flames with surprise that quickly shifted to calculated assessment. "Mrs. McKenna, Mr. McKenna," he called out with false joviality. "I was beginning to worry. We've been having the most interesting afternoon, organizing your papers and discovering several irregularities in your claim documentation." "What kind of irregularities?" Opal asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Well, it seems your marriage certificate wasn't properly filed with territorial authorities, and the mining claim deed appears to have significant gaps in the chain of ownership." Hayes smiled with the satisfaction of someone holding winning cards. "Fortunately, Consolidated Mining Corporation is prepared to resolve these legal complications through generous compensation." "How generous?" Tobias asked. Hayes named a figure that was perhaps 1/10 of what he'd offered the previous evening, enough to make them comfortable but nowhere near the fortune the land was actually worth. "And if we refuse, then I'm afraid you'll find yourselves in the unfortunate position of occupying land to which you have no clear legal title. Territorial authorities take such matters quite seriously." Opal studied the faces of the men surrounding Hayes, noting the professional confidence that came from executing similar operations many times before. "You've done this before. Business is business, Mrs. McKenna. Territorial development requires clear title to strategic resources. We simply facilitate necessary transactions by destroying people's legal documents and claiming their property, by resolving complicated ownership issues that might otherwise tie up important development projects in court for years." Hayes's mask of politeness was beginning to slip. "The railroad coming through these mountains will benefit everyone in the territory. Your claim represents a potential obstacle to progress, so you destroy the obstacle. We resolve it efficiently." The admission hung in the mountain air like gunpowder smoke, confirming everything Opal and Tobias had suspected. Hayes wasn't just stealing her property. He was part of a systematic operation to clear title for railroad development, probably affecting dozens of property owners across the territory. "There's one problem with your plan," Opal said calmly. "What's that?" "You burned the wrong documents." She reached into her coat and withdrew papers that made Hayes's eyes widen with sudden uncertainty. "The marriage certificate you destroyed was a copy. The original was filed in territorial court the day after our wedding, along with a will establishing joint ownership of all my property." Hayes's confident expression cracked slightly. "That's not possible. We researched." "You researched what you expected to find." Tobias moved to stand beside Opal, his presence shifting the dynamic from negotiation to confrontation. "You didn't research what someone with 40 years of frontier legal experience might actually do to protect herself. And you certainly didn't research what happens when someone tries to steal from a woman who once held off 40 cases of cholera with nothing but stubborn determination and practical knowledge." The mining company representatives exchanged glances, professional confidence giving way to uncertainty as they realized their careful plans had encountered complications they hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. McKenna," Hayes said carefully, "I think you may be misunderstanding the scope of the forces involved here. Consolidated Mining Corporation has territorial backing for these development projects. Individual property owners who resist necessary progress often find themselves facing difficulties they hadn't expected. Are you threatening us? I'm explaining reality. The railroad will come through these mountains whether you cooperate or not. Your choice is whether to profit from inevitable change or be crushed by it." Opal looked at the bonfire where Hayes's men had burned her recipe book, decades of accumulated knowledge reduced to ash and smoke. Then she looked at the cabin where she and Tobias had built something precious in the brief time they'd been together. "Mr. Hayes," she said with the calm authority that had once convinced desperate men to trust her judgment, "let me explain a different reality. This is my land, legally and morally. That cabin contains my home and my marriage. And if you think a handful of corporate thieves with fancy papers can take either from me, then you understand very little about the kind of woman who survives 40 years on the frontier." She pulled back her coat to reveal the rifle Tobias had taught her to use, held with the competent grip of someone prepared to defend what belonged to her. "Now I suggest you and your associates pack your equipment and leave my property before this conversation becomes significantly less civilized." Hayes stared at her for a long moment, apparently recalculating the odds of success against the determination he saw in her eyes. Around him, his men waited for orders that would determine whether this operation ended with negotiation or violence. "Mrs. McKenna," he said finally, "you're making a serious mistake." "No," she replied steadily, "I'm correcting one." 6 months later, spring had transformed the mountain valley into something that belonged in picture books, rather than the harsh reality of frontier life. Opal knelt in her garden, hands deep in soil that had been carefully amended with compost, and positioned to catch morning sun and evening shade. The vegetables she planted weren't just for survival now. They were for the simple pleasure of watching things grow, of nurturing life in ground that had become truly home. The legal battle with Consolidated Mining Corporation had ended 3 weeks after their confrontation at the cabin. Territorial authorities, faced with clear documentation of Opal's ownership and mounting evidence of corporate fraud across multiple properties, had ruled decisively in her favor. Hayes and his associates faced federal charges for document destruction and attempted land fraud, while the railroad company was forced to negotiate legitimate easement agreements with actual property owners. But the victory had brought unexpected consequences. The confirmed value of the Copper Ridge claim, combined with the railroad's need for passage rights, had made Opal and Tobias genuinely wealthy, not just comfortable, but wealthy enough to live anywhere they chose, in any style they preferred. "Regrets?" Tobias asked, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and the easy familiarity of someone who'd learned that companionship could be both comfortable and precious. "About what?" Opal accepted her cup, noting how he'd remembered exactly how. Much sugar she preferred, how he'd heated it to the precise temperature she found most satisfying. Small considerations, but ones that spoke of attention paid to her preferences and comfort. "About staying here. You could have a mansion in San Francisco now, servants, society, everything you gave up when you married a mountain hermit." She looked around the clearing where they'd built their life together. The cabin expanded now with a proper addition that gave them each private space while preserving shared areas. The garden that fed both body and spirit. The workshop where Tobias had resumed carving during long winter evenings, while she documented new herbal remedies she'd discovered in mountain flora. And leave all this for what? Parlor conversations with people who think wealth makes them interesting, social obligations that consume time better spent on things that actually matter? She smiled at the question. "I spent 70 years discovering what I truly valued. Why would I trade it for things I already know are hollow? The railroad had brought changes to their isolated valley, but fewer than they'd feared. The spur line that crossed their property carried freight and occasional passengers, but the engineering required to navigate mountain terrain meant trains passed only twice weekly, their distant whistle becoming just another voice in the mountains, conversation with itself. More significantly, the railroad had connected them to family scattered across territories and states. Opal's children, amazed by news of their mother's unexpected marriage and sudden wealth, had begun visiting the mountain cabin that had become the anchor for relationships strained by years and distance. "Your daughter's letter arrived yesterday," Tobias mentioned, pulling folded papers from his shirt pocket. "She and the grandchildren will arrive next month for an extended visit. Are you nervous about meeting them?" "Terrified," he admitted with the honesty that had become natural between them. "What if they decide I'm not good enough for their mother? What if they think I married you for money? What if they see what I see?" Opal interrupted gently. "A good man who chose love over safety, who saw value where others saw only. A burden who's made me happier in 6 months than I was in the previous 20 years. The marriage certificate that hung framed above their mantelpiece, the real one, properly filed and legally binding, had become the symbol of something that transcended legal convenience or mutual benefit. They'd married as strangers, seeking practical solutions to loneliness and insecurity. They'd become partners who'd chosen each other repeatedly through every challenge that tested their commitment. "I have something for you," Tobias said, reaching into his other pocket. What emerged was a small wooden box, carved with the same careful attention he brought to all his projects. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a ring. Not expensive or elaborate, but crafted specifically for her hands, sized to her finger, designed to complement rather than replace the wedding band she still wore from her first marriage. "It's beautiful," she breathed, accepting the ring with hands that trembled slightly. "But what's the occasion?" "No occasion. Just—" He paused, apparently searching for words to express something he'd never tried to voice before. "Just wanting you to know that if I had to choose again, knowing everything I know now about the complications and challenges and changes, I'd still walk into that auction and bid every cent I owned for the 70-year-old woman everyone else." Overlooked, Opal slipped the ring onto her right hand, where it caught morning sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the garden rows. "And I'd still choose the mountain man who saw something worth $100 in gold when everyone else saw only charity case." As they worked together in the garden, hands dirty with soil that would feed them through another winter, they moved with the coordination of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. The vegetables they planted would mature long after most people their age had stopped planning for future seasons, but they planted with confidence that they'd be there to harvest what they'd sown. The town of Clearwater, initially scandalized by their unconventional union, had gradually come to view them as something approaching local legends, the couple who'd defied social expectations, defeated corporate fraud, and proven that love could bloom even in life's supposed autumn. Young people facing their own romantic challenges often made the mountain journey seeking advice from the woman who'd found happiness when everyone assumed her chances had passed. But perhaps the most significant change was the simplest one. In the quiet evening hours, when work was done and conversation had settled into comfortable silence, Opal and Tobias would sit on their expanded porch and watch the sun set behind peaks that held no more secrets, no more threats, only the promise of another day in a life they'd chosen together. Sometimes the heart does see what younger eyes cannot. Sometimes love finds us precisely when the world believes we're too old for second chances, and sometimes the greatest risk is not taking one at all.